Picture 400 candles in a room built to hold 400 people, the double doors of Marchmont Hall standing open on the last Thursday of September, and a duke at the head of the ballroom raising his hand to the musicians as though he were raising it to heaven. He is about to open the ball. Every family within 40 miles has come to watch him do it, because everyone in that county knows the custom, that the master of a great house leads the first dance with the mistress of that house, and everyone in that county also knows that the mistress of Marchmont has not been seen since the middle of August, having been sent to the dower house at Netherwall by a note in her husband's own hand, which regretted that her health would not bear the noise of society. So the room waits, the way rooms wait, when they already know the answer. And the Duke of Marchmont turns, in front of the Lord Lieutenant and the Bishop's wife and every family whose rents he collects, and offers his arm to the woman in silver tissue who has stood at his shoulder for an hour, Mrs. Clarissa Ferrers, lately of Lisbon, widow, and leads her out onto the floor to open his ball. The musicians begin. The candles double themselves in the long mirrors. Fans move considerably faster than the music. It was, everyone agreed afterward, the most public thing a man of his rank had done in that country in living memory. And for one figure of that dance, the Duke of Marchmont believed he had got away with it. Then the doors at the far end of the room opened again. The old steward, who had announced 3 generations of that family, gave the room 2 names in the flat-carrying voice he had used for 40 years. The Earl of Ardennes. Her Grace, the Duchess of Marchmont. And the Duchess of Marchmont, who was supposed to be ill 12 miles away, came into the ballroom of her own house on the arm of a plain-faced man in unfashionable black, a man with a surveyor's sunburn on the back of his neck, wearing nothing that had come out of her husband's family, only grey silk and her mother's plain gold cross. And she walked the length of that floor at the pace of a woman who has all night. And the dance came apart in front of her, couple by couple, the way ice comes apart when the thaw finds the first crack. The Duke stopped. The woman in silver tissue stopped a half-beat later, and her hand slid off his arm, and the whole glittering length of her went white beneath the paint. And near the third pillar a lady from Durham said, not quite quietly enough, in the flat, astonished voice of a woman who has just recognized a face she last saw at a funeral that turned out not to be one, "Good God, that is Mrs. Ferrers's husband." The sentence went through 400 people in about 9 seconds. You could watch it travel. It went along the wall of chaperones and up into the musicians' gallery and around the card tables in the room beyond. And everywhere it went, it did the same arithmetic, that the widow on the Duke's arm was no widow, and that the man on the Duchess's arm was her lawful husband. Nobody had to be told what it meant. That is the particular genius of what she did. There was no accusation, no raised voice, no scene. There were simply 2 injured parties walking in together, and a room that understood everything at once. If you have ever been told to stay quietly out of the way while someone else stood in your place and wore your name, if you have ever been managed and pitied by the very person doing the injuring, then you already know what it cost that woman to cross that floor smiling. And this story was made for you. Before we go back to where it truly began, do 2 small things for me. Press subscribe so you do not miss how a banker's daughter dismantled a duke without ever once raising her voice, And leave a like if you believe the quiet ones see everything long before they say anything. Then tell me in the comments what city you are listening from. And tell me this as well. Would you have stayed obediently at the dower house, or would you have come through that door on the arm of the one other person in England who had been wronged exactly as you had? Because the Duke of Marchmont was about to learn, far too late and in front of everyone whose good opinion he had ever cared for, that his wife had known what he intended for 11 months, that she had sought out the man in the unfashionable black coat herself, in a wet field in December, and that every step of the evening he thought he had arranged had in fact been arranged around him. By her. With the patience of a woman who had been taught before she could ride a pony that the account always balances in the end. To understand how a banker's daughter from Newcastle came to walk into that ballroom on the arm of her rival's husband, we must go back 9 years, to a marriage that was never a marriage at all, but a purchase. Adeline Fairley was born over a counting house on the side in Newcastle, the only surviving child of Thomas Fairley of Fairley and Sons, private bankers, a man who had begun by discounting bills for Keelman and ended by holding paper on half the collieries in 2 counties. Her mother died of a fever when Adeline was 9 and left her exactly 3 things: a plain gold cross on a chain, a rope of pearls her husband had given her the year the bank opened its second door, and the habit of writing down every sum that passed through her hands on the day it passed. Her father did not know what to do with a grieving daughter, except keep her where he could see her, so she spent her girlhood on a high stool at the discount desk, learning the trade the way other girls learn embroidery. By 15, she could tell from a set of colliery accounts which pit was being robbed, because the neatest column in a ledger is very often the lie. Her father used to say she had a banker's eye and a clergyman's memory, and he said it with pride. And then he did the thing that rich men of his kind so often do to the daughters they are proud of. He decided that the one commodity his money had never bought could be bought at last, and that the commodity was rank. Rupert Aldis, 4th Duke of Marchmont, was 31, handsome in the cold northern way, and quietly drowning. Marchmont Hall had 11,000 acres, 400 years of portraits, a roof that ate £1,000 a year, and mortgages on it that had been rolled over so many times they had begun to breed. He needed £120,000. Thomas Fairley had it, and more, and wanted a Duchess for a daughter, and the 2 men settled the whole of Adeline's life in a room in Grey Street, across an afternoon and a decanter, while Adeline sat in the next room with a cup of tea going cold in her hands and listened, through a door left ajar by a careless clerk, to her own price being discussed in the tone menus for the purchase of a hunter. She was 20. She could have refused. She let herself be sold, because she was lonely, and because the Duke had smiled at her twice, and because she believed, as clever girls sometimes believe the stupidest things, that a man who signed for her would in time choose her. He never did. He was perfectly civil about it, which is worse. The settlement was drawn by Marchmont's London lawyers, and it was a handsome one. 120,000 in Fairley bank stock settled to her separate use, with the income payable to the Duke during the subsistence of the marriage, and, at her father's flat insistence, one further clause that the London men thought a piece of provincial fussiness and put in to be rid of him. If the marriage should be dissolved or annulled by the act, suit, or fault of the Duke, the whole capital, principal, and accumulations reverted to her absolutely, and the Marchmont mortgages, which Thomas Fairley had bought up quietly the same month at a discount, remained in the hands of Fairley and Sons. Nobody read that clause aloud at the wedding breakfast. 9 years later it would end a duke. The marriage itself was cold from the first winter, and it never got any warmer. Her husband was polite at breakfast and absent by supper, and he had a talent, which she came to recognize as the defining talent of his character, for letting things happen rather than making them happen. He did not forbid her the estate books. He simply never thought to ask whether she looked at them, and she did every quarter in the small room behind the still room where nobody came, and within 2 years she knew more about Marchmont than any man alive except the one who was robbing it. She knew that the Lincar levels, 1,100 acres of good silt, drowned every spring, because a drain cut in 1740 had never once been scoured, could be made the best land in the parish for the cost of 1 season of the Duke's stabling. She said so at dinner, once in the 2nd year, with the figures ready in her head. Her husband looked at her for a moment with the mild astonishment of a man whose horse has spoken, and then said, "My dear, Crewe manages all that," and turned to ask his mother about the shooting. She did not raise it again. She learned in that particular way that clever wives in cold houses learn not to offer her opinion. The Dowager Honoria was no help, being one of those formidable women who suspect any newcomer of intending to move the furniture. And Crewe managed everything. Mr. Ambrose Crewe, the Duke's man of business, a soft-spoken person of 40 with a beautiful clerkly hand and a way of appearing in a doorway before you had finished ringing, had come to Marchmont a year before the wedding. And by the time Adeline had been a Duchess for 3 years, there was not a lease, a rent roll, a repair, or a bank order in that house that did not pass through his fingers. Her husband thought this an excellent arrangement. It saved him having to think. Clarissa Ferrers came into their lives in the autumn of the 8th year, and she came in the most respectable way imaginable, which is how the dangerous ones always come. She was introduced at the Durham races by a lady of unimpeachable dullness as the widow of a wine merchant, Miss Ferrers of Lisbon, carried off by a fever during the war, poor creature, left comfortable but not rich, come north for her health. She was 32, and she was beautiful in a manner that had nothing to do with prettiness. She had a low laugh she used like a hand on a sleeve, and a trick of listening to a man with her head tipped very slightly, as though he were the first person that week to say anything worth hearing, and she wore half-mourning for a full season with an exactness that made every matron in 3 counties defend her. The Duke was enchanted within a month. Adeline knew about it before he did. Wives generally do, and a woman who reads accounts for pleasure knows it in a particular way, because betrayal has a shape in a ledger long before it has one in a bedroom. It began with small sums out of the household account marked as charity. Then, in the January, an order on the Newcastle house for £250 quarterly, payable to a Mrs. C. Ferrers, drawn by Crewe on the Duke's instruction and entered under the heading of drainage and improvements, which was, Adeline thought, standing in the cold little room with the book open and the candle going, very nearly funny, since the only drainage anybody at Marchmont had proposed in a decade had been proposed by her and refused. She wrote the sum in her own small book. She wrote the date. She did not say a word. The material violations came next, and they came in the order such things always come, from the edges of a woman's life toward its centre. In February, the Duke gave Mrs. Ferrers the use of the Marchmont box at the Newcastle Theatre, and the county saw her sitting in it on a night when the Duchess was in the house and had not been asked. In March he lent her the town carriage, so that the Marchmont crest went up and down Northumberland Street with another woman behind the glass. In April, Mrs. Pike, the housekeeper, came and stood in front of Adeline with her hands folded and her chin up, and said, in the voice of a servant who has decided to be dismissed rather than stay silent, that his Grace had been into the strong room with Mr. Crewe and had taken out the pearls, not the Marchmont pearls, which were entailed and could not be moved, her mother's pearls. The rope her father had bought when the bank took its second door, the only warm thing that had come to Adeline out of a short and gentle life, put into her hands at 9 years old on the day of the funeral. He had given them to Clarissa Ferrers, and Clarissa Ferrers had worn them to the assembly at Alnwick, and when a Miss Bulmer, whose father farmed at Lincar, had admired them, she had said, with that low laugh, that they had been a gift from a friend who felt they had been wasted where they were. Understand what that was. That was not a jewel. A jewel is property, and property can be replaced. That was a dead woman's clasp on a living woman's throat. And it was said out loud in a public room that Adeline Fairley had been a waste of her own mother. This was no longer a broken heart. This was theft, and it was the particular theft that takes a person's origin away from them and hands it to somebody else to wear. Adeline heard it from Betsy Nunn, her maid, who had it from the Alnwick footman within a day. She was doing the quarter's rent roll when Betsy told her. She finished the column she was on. She ruled it off. Then she opened the small book she now kept in the drawer under the seed catalogues, and she wrote, in her father's counting-house hand, 22nd of April, the Fairley pearls, my mother's, given to Mrs. C. Ferrers, worn at Alnwick, witnessed by not less than 60 persons. She did not cry. She had cried once in the second year over something much smaller, and had learned that tears change nothing a man has already decided. She did not go to her husband either. What she did was worse for him, though it would be a long time before he found out. She began to write things down in a way that could be proved. There is a kind of silence people mistake for weakness. It is not weakness, it is the silence that plans. The county did what counties do. There was pity, which she hated. And Clarissa Ferrers began that summer to speak of Marchmont Hall as though she were already measuring it for curtains, and told her one real friend in Newcastle, a woman who repeated it eventually to Mrs. Pike, exactly what she wanted and in what spirit she wanted it. I want him for the having, she said, not for the keeping. There is a great deal in that house that ought to have been mine. The night that ended the marriage, in fact, whatever the law would take another 2 years to say about it, was the 11th of October, and it happened because of a door. Marchmont Hall has a library with 2 doors, and the second, from the little book room where the estate maps are kept, does not shut properly in wet weather, and never has. Adeline had gone in after 11 to fetch the tithe map of Lincar, because she had been unable to sleep and had decided to be useful instead, and she was standing at the map press with a candle in her hand when she heard her husband's voice on the other side of the warped door, and then a woman's laugh, and understood that Clarissa Ferrers was in her house, in the library, at 11 o'clock at night. She did not push the door. She did not step back either. She stood exactly where she was, with the candle in her hand, and she listened to every word, and afterward she could repeat the whole of it, in order, because a sentence is easier to hold than a column. "Crewe says it can be done," her husband said. "There is a defect in the license, a genuine one. The parish was wrong on the entry, and Crewe has had council's opinion. It will take 2 years and cost the earth, and there will be talk, but at the end of it, the thing is void, and I am a free man." "And what of her?" Clarissa said. Adeline said afterward that this was the moment she was proudest of herself, because her hand did not move and the candle did not shake, and she was able to hear what her husband thought of her in a voice he had never once used to her face. "She will not fight it," he said. "You do not know her. She is the most obliging creature God ever made, loyal, dull, entirely without ambition. And she suspects nothing. She never has. She goes about her flowers and her little books and thinks the world is exactly as I tell her it is. She will weep for a week, and then she will do as she is advised. Her father is dead. She has no one. Where would she go? And there is this." And here his voice took the warm, confiding turn it had used to her exactly twice in 9 years. "When the thing is void, the settlement falls in with it. And I am told the whole of it comes free of her at last, so you may have the pearls out of the strong room properly and not on loan, and this room, and every room. She has had the wearing of my name for 9 years. You shall have the keeping of it." And Clarissa Ferrers laughed her low laugh and said the sentence that Adeline would carry, folded small, for the next 11 months. "Poor dutiful thing," she said. "I shall be kind to her. I shall let her keep the little book room." Now hear what she did, because this is the whole of her character in one movement. She did not scream, she did not weep, she did not fling the door open and give them the scene that would have been retold at every dinner in the county for a year, with her in the part of the hysterical wife. She stood in the dark until they had gone up. Then she took the tithe map she had come for, because she had come for it, and she was not going to be robbed of that as well, and she went to her own room and sat down at her writing desk, entirely calm in a way that frightened Betsy Nunn very much when she came in at midnight. She wrote the date at the top of a clean sheet. She wrote out the conversation, both voices, in the exact words, and she wrote at the foot of it the 4 things it had told her, numbered, the way her father numbered the risks on a bill. 1. That her husband intended to have the marriage declared void on a defect in the license. 2. That Ambrose Crewe was managing it, and had been managing it for some time, which meant Crewe had a reason of his own. 3. That her husband believed the settlement fell in with the marriage, which was the exact reverse of the truth, because nobody had troubled to read the clause her father insisted on. 4. That he believed she had no one. On that last one she sat for some time. Then she wrote underneath it, in a smaller hand, "We shall see." That is where the story turns, and it turns very quietly. Adeline Fairley had grown up among men who took other men's property for a living, and she knew the first rule of it, which is that an accusation without proof is a gift to the guilty, because it tells them exactly what you know and gives them the whole rest of your life to explain it away. She decided that night that she would act once, completely, in a manner that could not be argued with, and that she would never need to act again. And then she went to bed and slept, which she said later was the strangest part, and in the morning she came down and asked her husband politely about the shooting. What followed was 11 months of the least dramatic work you can imagine, and it is the reason the ball ended the way it did. She began with paper, because paper was the only weapon in that house that had ever obeyed her. Every quarter, when Crewe's fair-copied rent roll went up to the Duke to be glanced at and signed, Adeline made her own copy first, in a book bound in green cloth that lived under the seed catalogues, and beside each figure she noted where she had got it. Not what she believed, what she could show. She started to walk. A duchess who walks her own land is an eccentricity, but eccentricity in a duchess is permitted, and she went to the tenancies one by one that winter with a basket and a notebook, and asked plain questions in their kitchens and wrote the answers down. What rent do you pay? When did you last pay it? In coin or in kind? To whom? Have you a receipt? Would you swear to it? And a picture came up out of those kitchens, slowly, the way a stain comes through plaster. That was not the picture in the fair-copied books at all. Old Bulmer at Lincar was paying £42 a year, and the rent roll said 36. 2 cottages at Wall were paying rent for a house the books said stood empty. 3 tenancies had been quietly turned from lives into annual tenancies at will, which meant they could be put out at a season's notice, and not one of the 3 men could read the paper he had put his mark to, and every one of them said the same name when she asked who had brought the paper. Mr., Crewe, Mrs. Pike was the second ally, and she came unasked, one evening in November with her keys in her hand, and stood in the middle of the room and said she had been in that house since she was 14 and had never yet told a lie to a Marchmont, and then unlocked a drawer in the still room and produced 11 letters. Servants keep things, which is the great blind spot of people who are waited on. Mrs. Pike had kept every scrap that came out of the Duke's grates unburnt, and among the 11 were 2 of Crewe's covering notes to Mrs. Ferrers, enclosing bank orders and referring, in one of them, to our arrangement, which is a phrase no man of business has occasion to use to his employer's friend. Betsy Nunn was the 3rd, and Betsy could go where a duchess could not, and came back with dates. The 4th was Mr. Edwin Cargill, her father's old partner at Fairley and Sons, a dry Scot of 60, who had held her on his knee at the discount desk, and who came to Nether Wall in January and listened to her for 2 hours without once interrupting. At the end of it, he took off his spectacles and said, "My dear, the bank has copies of every order it has ever paid. And the bank has a duty to the holder of the settled fund, and the holder of the settled fund is not his grace, whatever his grace has been told." And then he said the sentence that changed everything. "Adeline, do you know who holds the Marchmont mortgages?" She said she supposed some London house. Cargill said, "Your father, and now you, in trust, and I have wondered these 9 years when you would ask." She sat very still, and then she began to laugh, and she had not laughed in 2 years, and Cargill said nothing, and poured the tea. Because she had understood something in that instant that her husband, that expensive incurious man, had never once troubled to understand about his own affairs. He was not merely married to a banker's daughter. He was in debt to her. And the 5th ally arrived in a wet field in December, before Cargill, in the least romantic circumstances 2 people have ever met in. She had decided, since nobody at Marchmont would drain Lincar, to drain the 200 acres of it that lay in her own dowerlands with her own money, and she had written to a firm in Leeds for a surveyor, and what came was a square. weathered man of 40 in a black coat, gone green at the seams, with a level on his shoulder and mud to the knee, who shook her hand as though she were a churchwarden, and said his name was Ferrers, Nicholas Ferrers. And could they begin at the outfall, since everything else was a waste of both their time? He worked with her for 4 days in the rain. He did not once call her Your Grace after the first hour, having discovered by accident that she could read a fall of levels and correct his arithmetic, at which he grunted and handed her the book and said, "Then you had better keep the figures, ma'am. My hand is bad in the wet." He listened to what she said, as though the answer mattered more than who had given it. And on the 4th evening, standing at the outfall in the last of the light, while the water finally ran the way it was meant to run, she realized with something like alarm that she had spent 4 entire days without once being managed, pitied, corrected, or explained to. She did not know yet whose husband he was. That came in September, and it came out of his pocketbook, and it turned everything she had been quietly building into something else entirely. Through that winter and spring 2 things grew side by side, and she was careful to keep them in separate books. In the Green Book, the case against Ambrose Crewe thickened page by page. In the other book, the plain quarto with the levels in it, 200 drowned acres of Linkar came back to life. They cut the new drain in February with 14 men off the parish who had been half starving since Crewe turned their tenancies to tenancies at will. And Ferrers stayed the whole of it at 4 shillings a day, and his dinner, which was less than his firm charged. And when she said so, he said that the firm did not know where he was, and that he had a reason of his own for being in Northumberland, and changed the subject to clay pipe. By April, the levels were carrying a green crop of oats where there had been rushes and standing water since before the American War. Old Bulmer walked out into it and took his hat off. She stood at the field gate with mud on her hem and thought, with a kind of astonishment, that this was the first thing in 9 years that she had wanted and had, and that it had cost £1,100 and not one word of anybody's permission. That is the other thing that was being built that spring, and it was not built out of documents. It was built out of being useful, and being answered, and being handed the book to keep because her hand was better in the wet. The pocketbook happened in May, at the trestle table in the tithe barn where they did the accounts, when he stood up too quickly to catch a roll of drawings, and the book went off the table and fell open, and out of it, face up on the flags between them, slid a miniature on ivory of a woman of about 30, with her head tipped very slightly to one side. Adeline picked it up and looked at it for a long moment the way you stare at a word in your own language and cannot read it. Then she said, in a perfectly level voice, "Mr. Ferrers, who is this?" And he took it out of her hand and put it back in the book and said, "That is my wife." He would have left it there. But she stood up and shut the barn door, which he told her afterward was the moment he knew, and she came back to the table and said, "Is your wife called Clarissa?" And Nicholas Ferrers sat down on the bench very slowly, like a man whose legs have been taken away, and said yes. So they told each other. It took them until dark, and it is the only conversation in this story in which either of them came near to breaking. He had married Clarissa Vale at Bath in the summer of 1814, a lively widow with a small independence and no family, and he had been 34 and shy and flattered past sense. Within 2 years she had gone through his money and a good part of his patience, and in 1817 she had gone to London for a season and simply not come back, having written him one letter saying that she found the life of an engineer's wife unendurable and did not propose to endure it. He could do nothing. A man in his position could not afford a divorce and would not be pitied for wanting one. He had lately begun to hear from a cousin in Durham that a Mrs. Ferrers, widow of a Lisbon wine merchant, was much talked of in the north. That was his reason of his own for wanting a season in Northumberland. He had come to find her, and he had not yet decided what he meant to do when he did, and then a duchess in a wet field had handed him back his own arithmetic corrected, and he had, he admitted, put it off for 5 months. And Adeline said, "She is my husband's mistress. She has my mother's pearls." Then she sat down opposite him at the trestle table with the lamp between them, and did the most fairly thing she ever did in her life. She said, "Mr. Ferrers, I am going to say something that will sound cold, and I would rather sound cold than waste your time. We can each of us go home tonight and be quietly wretched, and in 2 years he will have the marriage voided and she will be the Duchess of Marchmont, and nobody will ever answer for 1 shilling or 1 pearl or 1 word of it. Or the 2 of us can put what you know beside what I know, on paper, with dates, and take it out once, in front of people who cannot pretend not to have seen it. I do not want a scene. I want a case." And Nicholas Ferrers looked at her across the lamp for a long moment and said, "Ma'am, in 20 years of drainage I have never once been able to argue a man out of standing water. But you can lead it away and let it go where it must." Then he pulled the account book toward him and turned it to a clean page and said, "We had better begin with her name, not revenge." Evidence that was the whole of their agreement, made in a tithe barn over a lamp, and neither of them said a word that night about anything else, though Betsy Nunn, who had come with the lantern to walk her mistress home, reported to Mrs. Pike that her Grace had been smiling at the hedges the whole way back, and had not once mentioned the pearls. The name was where it broke open. Clarissa Vale, married at Bath in 1814, described in the register as a widow, and Ferrers had never in 6 years seen a line of proof of the first husband she had buried. So Mr. Tobias Velicott, an unexcitable solicitor from Newcastle who did work for the bank and had never once in his life hurried, was sent south to look, and he spent 9 days in the parish registers of Bath and came back with a certified copy of an entry made on the 14th of June 1808 in the parish of Walcott, recording the marriage of Clarissa Vale, spinster, to Ambrose Crewe, bachelor, clerk. The woman wearing her mother's pearls was not a widow, and was not, in law, Mrs. Ferrers, and never had been. She was Mrs. Crewe. She had been Mrs. Crewe for 6 years before she stood up in a Bath church beside a shy engineer and swore herself a spinster, which is bigamy. And bigamy in 1820 was a felony that sent people to the other side of the world. And her lawful husband was the man who kept the Duke of Marchmont's books. Everything Adeline had been assembling for 7 months turned over and showed its other face, and what she had taken for a vain man's affair became something colder and much older. They were not rivals in it, they were partners in it, and had been since before Clarissa was ever introduced at the Durham races by that lady of unimpeachable dullness. Cargill, going through the bank's own copies, laid the whole architecture out on 1 sheet of foolscap, and it was elegant in the way a good fraud is elegant. The quarterly 250 to Mrs. C. Ferrers was the smallest part of it. Under it ran a second stream 6 years old of repairs never done, timber sold as stormfall, tenancies converted at will and relet at a premium in cash, and a slow hemorrhage of the Duke's own rents into a Durham account in the name of a Mr. A. Crewe, agent, £14,000 over 6 years. And here is the part she turned over for a whole evening, because it changed what she was willing to do at the end. Her husband was being robbed too. He was not the author of any of it. He was the mark. He was a vain, lazy, incurious man who had handed his whole estate to a stranger because reading it himself was a bore, and who had then been supplied with a beautiful woman to keep him looking the other way while the estate was taken out from under him, a plantation at a time. It did not make him innocent. Nobody made him give away another woman's pearls or call his wife dull through a warped door. But it made him a fool rather than a villain. And there is a difference in what you owe a fool. And she decided that the difference was this. She would not shield him from one consequence of anything he had done himself. She would simply make sure that the men and women who had used him went down first and went down harder. Graduated like a rate. Then the escalation came, as it always does when the guilty begin to feel the floor move. In June, the Duke's London men served the citation in the suit to have the marriage declared void. In the same week, Crewe had eviction notices carried to 9 families at Linkar, including Old Bulmer, on the grounds that the improvements had raised the value and the tenancies at will were determined at Michaelmas. And Adeline understood, standing in Bulmer's kitchen with the paper in her hand, that they were selling the very land she had drained, and that Crewe had known she was draining it, and had let her spend £1,100 improving his own crop. In July a letter came to her from her husband's attorneys inviting her, with great delicacy, not to defend the suit, and observing that a lady of her constitution would find the process distressing. And in July the last thing, the thing she has never entirely forgiven. Mrs. Pike came up the stairs white to the lips and said that Mr. Crewe had been asking the servants, one by one, whether her Grace had seemed herself lately, whether she walked out alone, whether she talked to the tenants, whether she wrote a great deal at night. They were laying the ground for the other kind of quiet. A woman who is inconvenient can be made unwell, and a woman who is unwell can be made to sign, and a woman who signs can be put in a comfortable house near Harrogate with a companion and never come out. Adeline sat down at her desk that night and wrote to Cargill, to Vellacott, to Ferrers, and to one other person she had not spoken more than 50 words to in 9 years. Then she opened the green book at a clean page and wrote, "They have begun to hurry." Very well. Let us give them somewhere to hurry to. The other person was the Dowager Duchess Honoria, and Adeline went to her at the end of July in her cold blue sitting room at the Hall and did not plead. She put the green book on the table between them and asked her to read 4 pages, and then to say, as one woman of business to another, whether they were true. Honoria read for 40 minutes without speaking. She was 71, and had buried a duke and a son. At the end she closed the book and said, "My husband's grandmother brought the Wall plantations into this family. There has been a Marchmont at Linkar since Agincourt, and your Mr. Crewe has been selling it for firewood while my son writes notes about a woman's health." Then she rang the bell and told her maid to bring down the japanned box, and out of it she took the sealed counterpart of the marriage settlement of 1811, the duplicate that goes to the husband's family, unopened since the day it was executed, with the clause in it that the London men had thought provincial fussiness. She put it in Adeline's hands and said, "I do not like you, particularly, but I know what this family is for, and it is not for that woman. Tell me what you require." What Adeline required was patience, and everybody gave it to her, and that is the hardest thing she ever asked of anyone. Velicott entered no defence to the suit for nullity. He entered nothing at all. Through that summer, the Duke's London men wrote 3 increasingly comfortable letters about her ladylike acquiescence, and Crewe grew careless the way a man grows careless when nothing is pushing back. And in August he committed the mistake that would hang the whole case, drawing a new lease of the drained Linkar acres in favour of a Durham corn factor for a premium of £900. Paid to himself, and forging to it, because it needed the Duchess's consent as owner of the dower lands, a signature that he had never once had occasion to study closely. Adeline looked at it for a long while when Cargill brought her the copy. He had given her the wrong middle initial. In August, the letter came for Ferrers from a firm in Lincoln's Inn, redirected 4 times, informing him with regret that his second cousin, the Earl of Ardennes, had died at Nice, and that as the last male of the line he was now the 5th Earl, and would he be so good as to instruct them. He read it twice at the trestle table in the tithe barn and handed it to her and said, "I have not used that name since I was 22, and told my uncle I would rather build things than own them. It will be very useful now, will it not?" She said, "It will be extremely useful," and he said, "Then I shall wear it for one evening, and afterward you may call me Ferrers again." And in August the Duke, who needed the county to have swallowed Clarissa before the suit ended, so that there would be no awkwardness about receiving her afterward, announced that Marchmont Hall would give a ball at Michaelmas, the first since his father's day, 400 cards, the whole shire, the Lord Lieutenant, the Bishop. Adeline had her note about her health on the 12th of August. She kept it. It is still kept. Everything after that was arrangement, and she made it the way her father made a syndicate. Sir Hugh Pentreath, magistrate, a sound, dull man with a passion for drainage, was shown the Linkar works and invited to bring his wife to the ball, which he accepted with pleasure. Velicott took lodgings in the village with a locked box. Cargill came up from Newcastle with the bank's certified copies, the mortgage deeds, and a demand for redemption ready dated and unsigned. Mrs. Pike, who had the ordering of the house on the night, put the old steward at the door and said nothing to anybody. The certified Bath register, the forged lease with the wrong initial, the sealed counterpart, the 11 letters, the green book with 11 months of dates in it, and the sworn depositions of 9 tenants who could not read but could remember. All of it went into one flat leather case, and Adeline sat with it on the table in front of her at Netherwall on the evening of the 28th of September and did not open it. She had one decision left, and it was not a small one. She could send the case to Pentreath in the morning and have Crewe taken up quietly in a magistrate's parlour with 3 men present, and it would be perfectly effective, and nobody would ever know she had done it. Or she could take it where the injury had been done. She had been humiliated in the theatre box and at Alnwick in front of 60 people who had watched another woman wear her mother's clasp, and by a note about her health that half the county had heard of within a week. Private wounds may be healed in private, public ones cannot. So she wrote one line to a man in an unfashionable black coat 12 miles away, and the line was, "My Lord, are you free on Thursday evening?" And he wrote back, "Ma'am, I am at your disposal, and I shall want the carriage to arrive after the first dance has begun." So we come back to the candles, and to the moment the dance came apart. She did not stop in the middle of the floor. She walked past her husband and past the woman in silver tissue as though they were furniture, and she went up to the top of the room and turned, with the Earl of Ardennes on her right and the Dowager Duchess Honoria rising out of her chair on her left, and she said, in the clear carrying voice of a woman who has spent her life reading figures aloud to men across a desk, "Good evening. I am sorry to be late. I was told my health would not bear the noise." Somebody laughed, high and nervous, and stopped. The Duke found his voice and made the mistake of using it. "Adeline," he said, "this is not the place." And she said, "No, it is precisely the place. You chose it. You sent out 400 cards." And then she turned to the room instead of to him, which is the thing everyone remembered afterward, because she never once argued with him in front of those people. She simply told them facts, in order, and let them do the arithmetic themselves. She said, "Most of you know the lady on my husband's arm as Mrs. Ferrers, widow of Lisbon. She has no husband in Lisbon. Her husband is standing beside me. He is Nicholas Ferrers, and he married Clarissa Vale at Bath in June of 1814, and he has not seen her since 1817, when she went to London and did not come home." The silver tissue moved once toward the door and found that the door had the old steward and 2 footmen in it. And Adeline said, "That would be enough for one evening, and it is not the half of it. And Mr. Velicott, if you please." Velicott came forward with the flat leather case, and she laid it out on the card table that had been carried up for her, item by item, without heat, the way a clerk reads a discount list. This is a certified copy of the Register of the Parish of Walcott, in Bath. On the 14th of June 1808, Clarissa Vale, spinster, was married in that church to Ambrose Crewe, bachelor, clerk, 6 years before she swore herself a widow and married Mr. Ferrers. She is not Mrs. Ferrers, she never has been. She is Mrs. Crewe, and she is my husband's steward's wife, and the 2 of them have been in this house together for 2 years. There was no gasp. It was better than a gasp. It was 400 people not breathing. This is the lease drawn in August of the drained lands at Linkar in favour of a corn factor for a premium of £900 paid to Mr. Crewe. It bears my consent, which I never gave. He has written my middle initial wrong. This is a sheet prepared by Fairley and Sons from the bank's own copies, showing £14,000 taken out of the Marchmont rents into a Durham account in Mr. Crewe's name over 6 years. Timber entered as Stormfall and sold. Repairs charged and never done. 9 families to be put out at Michaelmas off land. I paid £1,100 to drain. And this is a note, sent to me in August, advising me that my health would not bear the noise of society. It is in my husband's hand. He wrote it 3 weeks after Mr. Crewe began asking the servants whether I seemed myself. She let that sit. Then she said without cruelty, and this is the part I have thought about most, My husband did not steal from this estate. He was robbed of it thoroughly for 6 years by his own man of business and the woman that man supplied to him, and he never once looked at a book to find out. He is not the author of it. He is only the reason it was possible. Somewhere in the second room a chair went over. Crewe had got as far as the passage to the gun room, and Sir Hugh Pentreath, with a warrant already sworn and in his breast pocket, met him there with 2 constables from Wall and took him without any fuss in front of the whole supper table. And the Duke of Marchmont stood in the middle of his own ballroom with 400 people looking at him, and did the only creditable thing he did in 9 years. He did not bluster. He looked at the papers on the card table, and then said, loudly enough for the room, "I have been a fool of the most expensive kind. I was told what I liked hearing, and I paid for the telling with my tenants and my timber and my wife's mother's pearls. And I called her dull, because it was easier than reading my own accounts. Nobody in this room has thought worse of me tonight than I think of myself." Then he turned to her and said, quietly, in front of everyone, "Adeline, tell me what you want, and it is done." And she said, "I have written it down." There were 4 terms, and she read them out. The suit for nullity would go forward unopposed, as he had begun it, and he would sign the decree the day it was offered. Every eviction at Lingcar would be rescinded within the week, and the 9 tenancies restored as tenancies for lives, at the old rents, in writing, before Christmas. Every paper Crewe had touched would be surrendered to the magistrate that night, and her mother's pearls would come out of the strong room and be put into her hands before she left the house. He agreed to all 4 in front of the county, and when he said, and afterwards, and could not finish it, she said the sentence they still repeat in that shire: "You did not send me away, Rupert, you made room for me." Then she said, "Sign the decree. It is the only true thing you have ever given me." Justice came down afterward exactly by the degree of the guilt, which is the only kind worth waiting for. Ambrose Crewe was tried at the Lent Assizes at Newcastle on 3 indictments: forgery of a lease, embezzlement as agent, and conspiracy, and the 9 tenants who could not read a word of the papers he had put in front of them stood up one after another, and old Bulmer, asked whether he was certain of the sum, said he was certain because his wife had counted it twice, and cried after. Crewe got 14 years transportation. He sailed in the autumn, and there is no record of him after 1831. Clarissa was tried in the same week for bigamy and got 2 years in the House of Correction at Durham, and the newspapers, which had never printed her name while she rode in a carriage with arms on the door, printed it 7 times. When she came out, she went to Boulogne with £140, all that could be found of hers, and wrote to 3 men she had known, and 2 did not reply, and the 3rd sent £5 and asked her not to write again. She had wanted the having and not the keeping, and she was left, in the end, with nothing kept and nobody having her, which is only her own arithmetic worked out to the last line. The decree of nullity came through in the following June, and the Duke of Marchmont signed it, as he had promised, on the day it was offered. He had begun that suit to be rid of a dull, obliging wife who suspected nothing, and it was the one thing he ever finished, and it did to him precisely what the provincial clause his lawyers had laughed at said it would do. The whole of the Fairley capital, principal and 9 years of accumulations, £191,000, came back to Adeline, Absolutely. The Marchmont mortgages remained where Thomas Fairlie had quietly put them in 1811, in the hands of Fairlie & Sons, and Fairlie & Sons was, from that June, her. She did not foreclose. That surprised the county, which had rather looked forward to it. She let the interest run at 4% and appointed an honest agent from Hexham. And she wrote to the Duke exactly one letter, which said that his tenants were her security and that she would foreclose the moment one of them was put out of a house for any reason but the courts, and there is no evidence that any tenant ever was again. He lived another 19 years, and he lived them soberly, in a house with the shutters mostly closed, and he learned to read his own accounts at 40 because there was nobody left to read them for him. He wrote to her every year on the anniversary of the ball. She never answered, and she never once threw a letter away either. And after his death, the whole bundle was found in a drawer at Ardennes with the seals unbroken. When people asked her about him, she said only, "I forgave him a long time ago." Forgiveness is not the same as return. She married Nicholas Ferrers, 5th Earl of Ardennes, in the church at Netherwall in the September after the decree. On a Tuesday morning, with no London in it whatever, the bride wore grey silk and her mother's pearls and her mother's plain gold cross. Mrs. Pike and Betsy Nunn sat in the third pew from the front. Mr. Cargill gave the bride away and wept without any embarrassment at all, and the church was filled to the porch with the drainers and the hedgers and the 9 restored families of Lincar. And the Dowager Duchess Honoria came in her own carriage and sat at the front and told anyone who looked at her that her son had been an idiot and that she was there for the family name, which had at last found somebody worthy of it. They had 26 years together. He built her a mill, and she built him a bank, more or less. And they argued happily about levels and interest for the rest of their lives, and he never in all that time called her anything but ma'am when he was pleased with her. Travellers on the Hexham Road are still shown the Lincar levels, 1,100 acres running green to the horizon where there was standing water for 80 years. And beside the church at Netherwall there is a plain schoolhouse she endowed, in which the daughters of tenants are taught, besides their letters, one thing that no other charity school in that county taught them, which is how to keep an account. She told her own children the same thing she told the girls at that school, that a woman who understands her own money cannot be quietly robbed, and that a woman who writes things down on the day they happen cannot be quietly told she is unwell. In her desk at Ardennes, until she died at 78, she kept a green cloth book with 11 months of dates in it, and folded inside the cover a note in a duke's hand, regretting that her health would not bear the noise of society. Her worth was never in being chosen. It was not diminished when he chose another, and it was not restored when the room turned. It had been in her hands the whole time, in what she knew and what she kept and what she could prove. And if you take one thing from this story, let it be that the woman standing quietly at the edge of the room, being spoken about and pitied and written to about her health, is very often the only person present who has been keeping the accounts, and that a man who tells the world he has sent her away should be extremely careful about which door he leaves open.